The Adirondacks have a rich historical tapestry of notable figures from the Civil War era. Abolitionist John Brown and Gerrit Smith founded the Timbuktu settlement outside of Lake Placid. The small farming town of Saranac made a significant contribution to the Union Army, sending 4 times the town's draft quota to the war effort, which was proportionately more than any other town in the North. Later, 5 men from Saranac aided in the capture of President Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And recently, another notable figure from Adirondack history has emerged, Lafayette Mason, who lived in what is now known as Elizabethtown.
Where I believe he first appeared, he's not listed by name because the United States Census records did not start listing the names of people in a family until 1850. Prior to that time, from 1790 through 1840, all U.S. Census records only listed the head of the household, and then the number of children, the number of women, the number of adults by age category. So I believe Lafayette Mason shows up for the first time in the U.S. 1830 census with his mother. But they're just simply checks in a box. They put anybody of color in just the category of free colored persons or slaves. And there was a black woman with a black child.
Historian Maggie Bartley believes this small check in a box is the first record of Lafayette Mason.
They're living in Ellenburg in Clinton County in the family of a white man named Lewis Ransom, who was a very well-known, wealthy, predominantly involved with politics, business, banking, education, very educated person. Lewis Ransom and a number of other leaders in Plattsburgh decided they wanted to build an academy, which was the next step you would go to beyond just basic grade one-room schoolhouse where you learned just your alphabet, reading and writing. And they created the Plattsburgh Academy in the 1820s.
Circumstantial evidence suggests that Lewis Ransom was Lafayette Mason's father, but even if that is not the case, Lewis Ransom was undoubtedly Lafayette Mason's benefactor.
Lafayette Mason is literate, and he can write cursive, not just block printing, which is what most people learned at a very early age, but he could write cursive. And for a person of color to be that educated, nobody was like sending normally their servants' kids to the academy. But this young man was literate. Most even white people weren't educated. There was really virtually no public school system in those days. If you wanted your child to be educated, you paid a tutor. Turns out also his wife was literate, which in those days was incredibly rare. Most of the Irish and German and Canadian immigrants that were settling in the Adirondacks couldn't even sign their own names. When we look at him, Lafayette Mason could certainly pass for a white man. But he married a black woman. He had children who were clearly black. He never lied about it. He didn't try to fake it. He's listed either as black, colored, or mulatto throughout all the records.
Lafayette Mason lived with the Ransom family until he was about 14 years old. He left the home shortly after Lewis Ransom died.
I believe he bolted in the spring after Lewis Ransom was dead. Mrs. Ransom, the widow, shortly after this remarried.
Mrs. Ransom also paid to have an unusual ad posted in the local paper.
It's one of these ads that starts with a big headline, 1 cent reward, all caps. Run away from the subscriber on the 25th day of April last. A mulatto boy named Lafayette, period. This is to forbid all persons harboring or trusting said boy on my account, as I shall pay no debts of his contracting after this date. M.B. Ransom, she didn't put Margaret, she just used her initials, dated Ellenburg, May 3rd, 1842. Who puts a wanted ad out for a child? my assumption is that she never had to pay that 1 penny reward because he didn't come back.
Lafayette Mason put his education to work and begins to establish himself in the Elizabethtown community.
He was voting, which for a black man, he had to own land to vote. The white men didn't have to own land, but he did. He also had credit at the local store. So that tells me that he was respected as a local business person. He was able to go to court and buy property. He was engaged in business with all the local leaders around here.
A law passed in New York State in the 1820s required black men to own at least $250 worth of property in order to qualify to vote. In response, abolitionist Gerrit Smith gifted thousands of acres of land to black men in the Adirondacks. Lafayette Mason was among those grantees.
In the 1850s, Lafayette Mason was given a parcel of land by Gerrit Smith so that he could qualify to vote. But Lafayette Mason never went and lived there. Now maybe he visited it, we'll never know. But the work and a place where he could make money was here in Elizabethtown, because in the 1850s, the Putnam family bought the iron forge at Split Rock Falls. And they were looking for labor, they were looking for people to make charcoal. Lafayette Mason ended up living in New Russia, which is a hamlet in Elizabethtown just north of the falls. And the contract that I found he wrote was to produce charcoal for the iron forge.
First, I will make a good turnpike road from the two forks of the roads in a direction to the job. Second, I will let him have wood for 50 cents a hundred, and team to draw the wood to the pits, and all hardwood. And he shall find grain for the team when he hires them. And I will draw his coal for $1 a hundred. Lafayette Mason.
And what he wanted to do was in 1860, he wanted to buy more land. So he bought from Gerrit Smith, he took a mortgage from Gerrit Smith in 1860 for 360 acres, which is basically the east side of Bald Mountain. It was $702 for 360 acres. And what he needed to do was cut hardwood and then haul it to the charcoal pits. It would be cooked into charcoal, and then he would haul it to the forge. And he needed trees, he needed a lot of trees. And he also had sons who could help. So he was in the charcoal business, providing the fuel for the iron forge. So he bought this property. And he owed a mortgage, and he made a down payment, and then he had to make one payment every year for like about 7 years. The following 6 months later, the Civil War began. A lot of men were going to war. There was a whole gung-ho, let's go to war and beat the Confederates. He didn't go until December of 1863, when the enthusiasm had waned and the Union Army had trouble getting soldiers. And they started offering an enlistment bounty. And they offered $350 if you would enlist. And so Lafayette enlisted. That's probably the money that his family survived on while he was gone. I mean, they caught fish, they raised their vegetables, they did what everybody did. But nobody paid the mortgage to Gerrit Smith. In the November of 1864, he'd been in just about a year. They were at Fair Oaks in Virginia, and they were ambushed by the Confederates, and he and many of the men in the 118th were taken prisoner.
The 118th is raised in the summer of 1862. General Lee defeats the Union Army outside of Richmond, and with that, Abraham Lincoln calls for reinforcements. He calls for 300,000 troops. And the 118th was one of the regiments that was raised in New York State. There was quite a few regiments, probably close to 500,000 men that were raised, even though they only wanted 300,000. This was the second wave of patriotism that brought people into the Civil War. 118th was raised in the counties of Clinton County, Essex County, and Warren County. So Lafayette joins in December of 1863. And he is part of the biggest wave of recruits that hits the 118th during the Civil War. There's about 150 thereabouts, so approximately 150 people that joined the regiment in December and January of '63. The Civil War had linear tactics, which means they fought in lines. But in order to be a really good regiment, you had to practice and practice and practice. And that's what these guys did. The 118th, otherwise known as the Adirondack Regiment, was an elite regiment. They were very proud of the tactics that they could do on the field. And you have to remember that when you were in battle, you were asked to do things that had to be rote. You can't think about it. It has to be company A, wheel left. And they have to know what that means. And they have to do these things pretty quickly.
In May of 1864, the 118th Division left garrison duty and put their training to use in several battles.
They fight in Drury's Bluff, they fight in Cold Harbor, they fight in Petersburg, they fight in Fort Harrison, they fight in Fair Oaks. And all those 5 battles in which they lose a great deal of men.
On June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1864, the 118th took part in the Battle of Cold Harbor.
They are part of a wedge, a big, huge, like a column that attacks across a field. Lafayette was in this too. And they witnessed the carnage of Cold Harbor. At Cold Harbor, Grant lost about 7,000 men, death and casualties in a matter of 45 minutes. Fair Oaks was in October 27, 1864. Grant, who was head of the armies, of the Union armies, just wanted a diversion. His main attack was going to come in Petersburg, but he wanted Butler and the Army of the James just to go up there and say, hey, here I am, we're attacking you, it just seemed like we're going to attack you, but we're really not. The reality was, the problem was, Butler thought that he could capture Richmond. And so what he did was, he took the 18th Corps, which the 118th is part of, and decided to attack these entrenchments. The Confederates realized they were going to do it. The 118th were out front. The problem was, they were stuck way out in front without any support. There was supposed to be support coming up to them. And they didn't come, they waited. The Confederates noticed that they were out there by themselves and ripe for the picking. So they came out of their entrenchments, outflanked them on both sides, and demanded their surrender. Out of the 202 men that were in this engagement, Fair Oaks, 101 of them got captured, of which Lafayette Mason was one of them.
After being captured, Lafayette Mason is taken to Salisbury Prison in North Carolina.
Salisbury, North Carolina, everybody's heard of Andersonville. Andersonville is the worst prison in the Confederacy. Salisbury is a very close second. This is the biggest prison in the Confederacy. We're talking tens of thousands of prisoners that were there. And it was only meant to hold like 10,000 at the most. And there's 20,000+ people. And they're losing upwards of 50 to 100 people a day, starving to death. The Confederacy is barely surviving at this point. The Union soldiers, they really don't care that much about. They're barely feeding them. They give them soup that's got weevils, it's got bugs.
It was a very, very bad place to be. The Confederates couldn't feed their own soldiers, much less prisoners.
Salisbury was one of those horrible, horrible places. And so when you died, they had huge pits. They would just they'd dig a long trench, they'd throw you in and they'd fill them up there. Supposedly 20,000 men died in Salisbury. But in March of '65, the war is close to the end. For the Confederacy, they exchange all these troops. And so Lafayette Mason, as well as all the other Union troops that could walked about 60 miles to Goldsboro, took a train to Wilmington, then from Wilmington, took by boats to usually all the hospitals around the East Coast.
He survived barely and then was swapped in March of 1865 in a prisoner swap. The doctor here, Dr. Midas Bishop in New Russia, said he was a skeleton when he got here. His health had been destroyed by that experience. And the mortgage had not been paid. And he could barely work. I mean, luckily he had children that worked, but it did not, he didn't get any kind of aid. There was no aid for these people when they came home. And he lost his property because Gerrit Smith had turned that mortgage over to his niece, Catherine Kemys. Catherine Kemys lived in Albany, and hey, it was just money owed. And they took him to court, and he lost. He lost the land, he lost his home, and he and his wife and his youngest children, who were still living at home, moved to Iowa. Then the opportunity came that men who had fought in the Civil War were offered land grants in the Dakota Territory. And he accepted that, and he was able to get a land grant piece of property in Minnehaha County and moved up there. The really interesting thing was I looked up his plot of land that he had, and it's there's a brook, a river that runs alongside of it. He was probably one of the first people to live up there, other than the actual Dakota Indians who were there. And the name of the stream that borders his property is Split Rock. And I kept thinking, but that's where he worked, down here. So I think he named it, because it's just too coincidental that that name of that brook along his property is called Split Rock. So he died there in July of 1879. He was 52 years old. There is a small cemetery on the corner of his property called the Sherman Cemetery. He is probably buried there since that's where he died. He does not have a headstone. I think he needs to have his headstone. We're going to work on that. Two of his daughters lived in Vergennes, Vermont. They were the older girls who got married before he left and went out west. So they were already married and had families. And one of them was married to the first black sheriff in Vermont. So a historic marker was put up 2 years ago for Stephen Bates, and his wife, Frances Mason Bates, lived in Vergennes. Lafayette Mason really left a mark, and I think it's really amazing in a place where it's not only environmentally inhospitable here, it was socially inhospitable, but he managed to make it work. Not only did he overcome a lot of adversity, but a lot of people in those days had incredible adversity, is that for a black man at that time, when slavery was just ending in New York when he was born. I mean, the leftovers of that were still in place. And to rise up so well. My saying is always, don't ignore people just because they're dead. Because sometimes they want to be heard.